Hear me now?
Yes, sir. We're recording now, Sean. And I do
Ah,
like the
there we
cold
go.
open,
Yeah,
but not that cold. Not that cold where I divulge private details about
right.
business deals.
Yep. With the well, especially considering some of the folks you're working with. I had a student the other day who was we got into joking about how he's got the Polish mafia um preferring privacy. Let's put it that way.
Oh,
And I
okay.
don't know if he was entirely kidding, but either way, it made for a
Who was
good
that?
joke. Was that like it's one of the students in Ian's 90 Days to Freedom program.
Oh,
Probably shouldn't
okay.
say more in case there
Yes.
is the Polish mafia involved.
Okay.
Which again, I'm not 100% sure he was kidding, but we get a lot of characters in there.
You coach inside 90 Days to Freedom, do you?
Correct. Yep.
With Matthias, is that right?
Yeah, with Maddie.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know he goes by Maddie. Okay, that kind of makes
Yeah,
sense. He
yeah,
is Australian after all. Nobody ever uses
yeah,
their full name in Australia.
yeah. That's true.
Um, and yeah, how long have you been doing that for?
Oh man. Let's see. Late 2020, I want to say.
Oh wow,
Um,
that's a long time. That's
yeah,
cool.
it might have been 2021, early 2021, but somewhere around that time.
And do you do a lot of copy coaching generally, Sean?
I do in that group, and then I have another group I do. So like every Thursday and Friday, I've got calls. And then I occasionally do, the little bits and pieces there. I also coach inside Ian's other group, his email collective. Um,
Hmm.
and it's kind of an interesting mix because I get, you know, 90 Days of Freedom is for up and coming freelancers. The other group for me is more for business owners. And then that last group is people doing affiliate marketing. So it's very interesting how those audiences eat very different things.
Hmm.
And yet there are core principles that cut across all three.
Tell me about affiliate marketing because I think, you know, as things are getting a little bit tighter in the sort of client getting space for copywriters, you know, other avenues where they can put those copy skills to work are making more sense than ever before.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting you should ask because the like and that's a group too. I've been in there for a while. I mean, about the same timeline as everything else. And one of the things I see over and over again is like once you kind of have your basics nailed down, and they have a particular way of doing it, which that's kind of the client secret sauce. So I won't go into detail on that. But um, basically, like once you have the technical side pinned down, copywriting is a differentiator, right? Like that, and then of course, and it's just like with a lot of things, volume, right? Like whoever
Hmm.
can spend more to acquire customers will win. I would say, and that's the thing too, is like that is still pretty true in affiliate marketing in a lot of cases, especially if you're going for like really big mass market stuff. Um, but that being said, like, and that's the thing is that I see the appeal for people that aren't really into copywriting to get into affiliate marketing. I think that makes sense. But if you already have copywriting in your back pocket, I wouldn't call it an immediate leg up, but it will pay off. Like you'll still have to kind of learn the ropes of the affiliate world, but it's a really good thing to have long term.
And are you teaching with affiliate or the group you're involved with teaching affiliate like using email lists or through paid traffic on Facebook
Paid
or something
traffic.
else?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Are you
Yeah.
a media buyer as well?
I'm not. I'm just full copywriter. I am kind of curious to get into that side of things just because I know that's sort of the full stack approach. But yeah, I've historically only ever done copywriting, which I feel like makes is kind of rare these days. Um, and it's honestly just because that's the thing I enjoy most. Like I was a writer before I got into copywriting. I've been a writer since I was like 12. So copywriting just came along as a way to make a living from it. That's frankly much better than any of the alternatives in terms of like income and lifestyle, right? Like uh I still have other creative projects in the works, but there's a reason why I didn't want to go pin my entire income on any of those things. Like those are really competitive industries. And if you're going to try to climb up the traditional way, it's tough, right? Um, and I've always been kind of fascinated by people who make lateral moves across industries, and that's kind of how I think of it more. Is like I'd rather like carve out the space to create what I want and then find my way in versus having to work my way up from the bottom.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting. I think the way you've done things is kind of the way maybe before BizOp copywriting became a thing. Like
Yeah.
copywriting was like actually a way for people who were already writers, like, how the hell do I basically not starve and pay, pay rent while pursuing this artistic career, right? It was kind of like
Yeah.
a lucrative side gig for people who had artistic ambitions.
Yeah, and I think honestly that will remain true in the long run. Like it's been interesting to see, everything from because I was there for all of it, right? Like first no one knew what copywriting was, aside from people already, pretty deep in the game. Then, like you said, the biz amplification, then the big AI scare, right? And then now we're seeing the backlash to the AI scare where people are realizing like, it only all it really can do is help people that already know what they're doing do it faster at a bigger scale, which is great. But it's
Hmm.
like the idea of like, I mean, and I know there are other AI biz ops, but as far as like being able to replace a copywriter with I frankly I don't know if that'll ever be true, right? I think the closest we're getting is like really well trained, people who really deeply understand copywriting and are really good with the tools.
Hmm.
Like I said, they're able to move a lot faster. And even then, it's funny actually, I was going back to some of your old episodes and I noticed this topic came up and it's been interesting to see how they have like even the teams that have cut back, right, on their copywriters have ended up having to rehire. And then on top of that, like the people at the top who are really, really good at both copying and AI, like they are scooping up more gigs, but it's not the entire industry, right? I don't think it's possible for that to ever happen, really, um, for reasons we could get into. Um, but yeah, I think what's interesting is like as we encounter more and more of the limits with AI, we're going to see more of a resurgence of like, hey, creative folks, right? Like if you're naturally creative, come be a copywriter because that's the thing we can't get the AI to do. Right.
I have asked this question, and some people claim, oh, well, my AI copy's crushing it. But it's like, I don't know if that's, it always feels to me like the final polish is always the person. Like, the power tool metaphor is a good one. It's like, it's a really like good quality Milwaukee battery drill. It's a hell of a lot better than like, one of those old hand powered screwdrivers with
Hmm.
the little pulley wheel.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. It's like, yeah, it's super good for like being more productive, but you
Yeah.
still need to be a carpenter.
Right. Well, and what's interesting too is that I've talked to a lot of people that actually have had really good things come out with no editing.
Hmm.
But here's the thing. Those are people with huge libraries of existing content that they were able to feed in. And even then they had to like basically walk the AI through and educate, like, okay, here are the specific things I do, da da da. And then with that, like sometimes you can push a button and get something perfect out. Sometimes, right? More often, it's like you say, it's that final polish to like get at that, just those last few things that you wouldn't quite say. Um, but case in point, right? I think that's the thing that like nobody really wants to talk about. Well, not nobody, some people are talking about it, but it's like if you're not in a position where you have a ton of existing content to leverage, the AI is not going to do that for you, right? Like at best, the best you can hope for is for it to, squeeze out some pretty generic stuff that you can maybe like bend and twist into something usable, but it's not going to have the same impact as someone that has a unique voice that then they can use the AI to replicate, right? But you have to build the unique voice first. And the way you build a unique voice is by writing and creating content and speaking and all this stuff that people are trying to skip, right? So,
Yeah, you can't have a personal brand without a personality.
right,
and
right.
and
Even,
it
well,
and you can't automate it. You cannot yet automate a personality. Maybe you will be able to later.
even yeah, maybe, but again, it's like if you look at like how LLMs work, and I'm no expert on like the mechanics of AI, but I like broadly, they're giant parrots, right? Like so the thing they need something to parrot first, right? Um,
Oh,
and so unless that changes, uh, that we're going to end up back in the same situation. And the other thing too is like with it's interesting. You said like you have to have a personality first, which I agree with, but also the skill of communicating your personality is its own thing. Like
Mhm.
I've met plenty of fascinating people with like amazing stories that just can't communicate them to save their lives, right? It's a skill. Um,
Yes.
and it's something I mean, as a writer, right? Like I've always been fascinated by that and kind of built my life around that. Um, and it's a little frustrating element to watch people discount that out of hand. But at the end of the day, like I I think history is going to prove us right on this one. Like,
Okay. I know that like that whole thing of it's a parrot. I know some people get really pissed off about that. I know like Sam Woods doesn't like that. But I don't think it's a parrot, but I'm just like the most interesting people are like weirdos, you know. They're
yeah,
they usually like horribly fucked up in some way or like have really lopsided personalities or like, are amazing in some areas, or have some just have some massive like blind spot, for all the ways in which they're inadequate as a human being or messed up. And it's like machines don't really do that, you know. They either work or they don't work. And the idea of like being functional but messed up isn't really like a machine type of thing. I don't know what the word is, but
right,
you see what I'm driving at here.
right. It kind of reminds me of oh God, there's that old quote. Was it Dostoevsky? There's this great quote about how like, or it might have been actually about Oscar Wilde. It feels like an Oscar Wilde quote, but it goes, happy families are uninteresting because they're all happy in the same way. Unhappy
Mhm.
families are all unhappy in a different way, right? Like, and I think to your point about like just lopsided personalities, like people can be messed up in infinite ways, right? And that's what makes them fun. Um, it's hard to get that out of a machine, right? Again, unless it has something to copy, right? Unless you can present it a model of here's how weird I am, make it sound like this.
It's going to get interesting when they start embodying these machines properly. When like the type of like Boston Dynamics type of technology gets gets good enough and cheap enough that it can be mass produced, because you start putting these AI brains into, uh, doesn't not necessarily bipedal, but just bodies that can get around in the human world and start engaging with us. And probably personality will be emergent of some sort.
That's a tricky one. So my biggest pushback on that is, speaking of emotion, where does emotion come from? Kind of a big question, but one of the things we know for sure is that our bodies play a huge role in that. And I'm not just talking about like the chemicals in our brains, but like literally like physically, like we feel emotions all throughout our bodies
Mhm.
through all these different interacting systems. And so until like the idea that a machine can have emotion, I won't say it needs to have the exact same systems that we have, but it needs some kind of ecosystem like that, right? Because otherwise, like we develop personalities and preferences by interacting. We meet a stimulus in the world. It triggers this mess of all kinds of different internal stimuli, and then from that emerges our personality, emotions, preferences, etc. And so it's one thing to be able to, for example, like with Boston Dynamics, it's one thing to be able to like spatially navigate, but to have like touch and feeling and to form preferences around those things, very different animal, right? Again, not impossible. I don't think it's necessarily impossible, but it's like that's a very different ball game. I think a lot of times when people talk about it, they're confusing different kinds of capability. Like there's the ability to like do things, and then there's like what happens inside. Like there's internal capabilities that we have that the machines don't currently.
Okay, this is the idea of like properties that are emergent rather than and which people have and living
Right,
creatures have, whereas versus properties that are engineered, which machines have.
right. Well, and engineered and measured externally, right? Like we tend to judge machines by like the outputs, right? But as anyone who's actually studied psychology knows, like the outputs are the least reliable way to study a person, in some ways, right? Like people will do certain things in response to certain stimuli, but unless you really look carefully and understand like what's happening on the inside, like you won't get like why they're doing those things. And when it comes to persuasion, that's the key thing, like to understand why people are doing things and being able to engineer solutions around that. Like, I mean, that's copywriting in a nutshell, right? We just happen to use words for it. It's also sales in a nutshell. Um, and I mean, I think that's the thing, right? Like there are certain things that you can brute force with a large enough data set, and we're starting to see more and more of that with AI. But I think there's always going to be edge cases, and I think the edge cases are only going to become more important over time. It's interesting seeing how a lot of people too are even in our space are moving more towards like personal branding, quote unquote. I think this is part of that. Is like it's the mass market stuff only goes so far, and it's getting harder and harder to keep up every day. So if you can carve out a unique niche via your personality, that's now the thing to chase, right? Like that's a way to carve out some white space, even as everything, as mass market things just get into a bloodier and bloodier ocean.
Yeah, there's so much. Well, with selling of services, there's so much of everything around. There's so much choice, and it's really impossible to differentiate anymore on the
Hmm.
basis of anything. But is this your flavor? Do you
Right,
like pistachio?
right.
You know, like I think Tate was talking about this recently about you know just getting to the point where it's oh wow, thank you, Danny. um, that it's harder and harder for people to break through with just ads. And
Yeah.
he spends a lot of money on advertising, but why is he's advertising didn't get him known, and he's just the most prominent example. He got known by being really, really loud, really polarizing, and having a
And
really extreme personality.
yeah, and communicating it through or long form organic content primarily. Like that, like, he went and appeared on other people's media. And of course there's the whole ecosystem of like that being chopped into smaller clips that then become memes, right? But that first domino is like being willing to do those long form interviews on other people's shows, right? So like case in point. And even now it's so funny, like I think one of the most interesting examples of like the whole like brand versus DR dichotomy is because DR people will talk to high heaven about how, you know, branding is dead, it's old school, it doesn't work, da 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 da. And yet, if you go and like study the like some of like the really like grandmaster old school promos, a lot of them feature celebrity endorsement of some form.
Mhm.
Well, what is a celebrity if not a person with a brand? And how did they build that celebrity, right? By basically acting like brands, by doing, long form, slow drip, patient, overtime content, whether it's movies or whatever else, to build a persona that people want to be like or want to connect with. And then that's the thing that, yes, you can exploit that in a DR context, but DR didn't create that thing, right? Someone with a branding mindset created that thing. Um, I think now, like we're just seeing those worlds merge more and more. It's like, to your example, like whatever return he's getting on his ads is partially dependent on the work he did back then. It wouldn't be, he'd just be another shouting guy, right? Without the reputation already established.
Yeah, I have a friend who's very, very much like a hardcore direct response guy, and very good at cold traffic conversion about selling things directly on cold. Write the ad, write the sales page, get a complete stranger to buy his product within whatever 20 to 30 minutes of seeing his ad. He's very, very good at it. He talks about it. He's like, a lot of the people who are talking about branding, especially on Twitter, are just spoofing about things they have no clue of and they don't have to be accountable for. And he's right, but I don't think that's the full story. I mean, when people break through, they do have to go beyond just having an offer. They have to go they have to get a following, and that is a brand. If to
Yeah.
really grow up and get bigger, at some point they have to grow a following of people who want them for them. And the other part as well is, I mean, when you buy something now, you are always going to do a little bit of research around it. There has to be some, even if it's just like something as simple as Google reviews or Amazon reviews or even Facebook reviews. I know they're not such a big deal. Trustpilot reviews, and those are all brand elements, in my mind. I know like testimonials on a landing page, sure, but like stuff that's searchable, findable, I see them all as brand elements, and you mostly do have to have those before people will buy your stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, especially like to me, branding is very closely tied to what is memorable. And I think
Mhm.
what's so interesting about like it's funny because even someone like actually it's funny now I'm remembering I remember I saw someone who was like another really hardcore PR guy, um, kind of throwing stones at Dan Kennedy at one point because he said like Dan Kennedy's not a PR guy, he's a branding guy. And I'm like, that's actually kind of true, right? Like, if you read a lot of his stuff, he is talking about a lot of DR, but he is a personal brand builder. Um, and I think what's so interesting about him is like he it's not it's not just being polarizing, right? It's that you remember him for having a specific approach. And that's the thing that like I think a lot of people wanting to be thought leaders try and fail to do this, where it's like you're running your business, you have a certain problem, and your next thought is, man, I wonder what Dan Kennedy would do here, right? That's actually like a real example of a brand for this kind of figure, right? Like it's not just like, oh yeah, like I know him for being willing to crack dirty jokes or whatever, or being kind of a hard ass. It's like, no, he solves problems in a specific way that's interesting. And now I have a new problem. And I don't know his answer to it. Well, let me go see. Oh, he's got a book on team management. He's got a book on productivity. Great, right? I can go find his particular take on this thing, which I want more than just a generic solution. Because I probably tried generic solutions and they didn't work, right?
Yeah, and you don't want to go and buy some boring productivity book that's gonna you get 10 pages
Right.
in and be like, oh, this sucks so bad. You want it because you know Dan's gonna crack some jokes and like he's gonna have some salty, spicy viewpoints, and you know that it'll make it all more palatable.
Yeah.
That's your flavor.
Yeah. 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 It's interesting. It's like because sometimes I think about like why how I ended up being part of Ian's team, right? And it's like same thing. I years ago saw him speak, actually back when I was working full time in house. He was a guest speaker at one of their masterminds, and just like it was his vibe more than anything else. And partially like talking about like lifestyle and freedom and stuff. But it was like I could tell there was like it wasn't just that he was talking about the things that I wanted. It He had similar feelings around those things, right? Like when he said free, like because freedom, I think it's funny. It is one of the easiest words to abuse in copywriting because like everyone wants freedom, right? But like, what does that mean? Freedom to do what, right? That actually matters enormously depending on who you're selling to.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah, like I mean, because for me, like freedom, like one of my big things is like freedom to think. I just like thinking, right? I don't necessarily need to like. I mean, I do like traveling too, but I don't necessarily like. I've never really wanted to go like full digital nomad or anything like that. But just like having time to get my morning coffee, having time to do things a little bit slowly, like freedom from rush has always been a big thing for me. Um, and that's similar to what Ian talks about. So there we go, birds of a feather flock together. Like um, it's those deeper layers which I think you really only get from talking to people, um, and from reading books. I think that's the thing I like most about books. It's funny actually. A friend of mine posted recently about how he was working on his book, which is nonfiction, and he had this. The original version was full of like all these. It was basically structured like a memoir, right? Like he was kind of going through his major life events in order, and talking about them. Um, and he's like, oh, this isn't tactical enough. I need to like strip all that stuff out. So he basically cut it down to just the facts, right? Like, here, do this, here are the things that lessons learned. And then it was like it just wasn't clicking, right? Like, it was super choppy. He didn't even enjoy reading it. So then he went and put back in the other stuff, but now using that as the spine, right? So it's like, okay, well, here are the key lessons, and then I'm going to backfill the personal stories that support them, which I actually think is a brilliant way to write a book, right? Those are my favorite nonfiction books. And it just goes to show, like, people who read books want that stuff. They want the stories, the anecdotes, the connections. Because honestly, it's like it's the same way I've always read. It's like because I don't really remember things that are just like tactics, right?
Nobody does. We remember the
No,
stories.
yeah. I remember, and funnily enough, the stories allow me to remember the tactics, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, like, um, like one of the most random ones that's been stuck in my head for years was I read a book called Wonderland that was talking about like the influence of like leisure on history, which is fascinating. Uh, and one of the little stories in there is he talks about how in the 18th century there are these women going around with little mirrors, like kind of amber tinted mirrors, and they would basically go hiking in the countryside and like find a nice view, and then hold it up and look at themselves because
Oh
it looked
my
like a painting.
God. Really?
Literally,
Oh my
yes.
God.
They called them like painting glasses or something like that, but it was the idea of like, oh, you can look at yourself and make it look like a
In a
painting because it
painting.
has the color, right?
Oh,
And
that's
I'm
so
like,
bizarre.
it's an Instagram filter like over
Yeah,
200 years ago.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
I'd
But it
never
just
heard
goes
of
to
this.
show, oh yeah. Well, and it's funny too, like that's why I love history, is that like it really grounds you in the fact that like nothing ever really changes. The details change a lot, but the core themes are always there, right? People are people wherever they go, even in time. Uh, and in particular, it's like, I think you can get such interesting ideas for copy there too, because it's like how many, all the people that run around reading like their 12th copywriting book. It's like, all right, sure, have fun with that. When you need to actually like inject a story into your copy, what have you got? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, the number one source is like living an interesting life, right? But people who write books tend to lead interesting lives too. And if you can pull from history as well, even better. There's such a huge pool of things to write about. It's why I've never really understood people who like. I think writer's block is basically a myth. And particularly, it's like if you just don't know what to write about, like you just need to absorb more things.
Yeah. Anytime I've never like not known what to write, it's because I've been lazy about doing the research.
Yeah,
If you've done your research, you'll have something. You've done enough
yeah.
research, you'll have something that grabbed you that you'll find the thin end of your wedge that you can start driving a crack open in the project.
Yeah, and yes, the research, but also like I think that's the thing people underestimate too is how much it pays to just be a curious person. Like, which again, I think there's a lot of overlap between people who are just naturally curious and people who set out wanting to be writers, right? Like, um, because I don't, it doesn't feel like work to me to gather all these little random facts that I have. I just, it just is a byproduct of the things I'm already interested in, and which is kind of everything, right? Um, and I do think part of that is maybe personality and nature, but I also think it's a skill. Like curiosity itself is a skill that you can practice. Um, and so like when it comes to like obviously yes, you need to do your research for a specific project, but like just paying attention, even just like paying attention to like the kind of media you consume normally is a good start. But also like read things that have nothing to do with this space. Read books about any random topic under the sun. Audio or just put on audiobooks, right? I actually find that I absorb a lot more from audiobooks um, when it comes to this kind of stuff, like just good stories and nuggets like that. Because it's like it's almost like wallpaper for my brain in a way that when I'm reading a book on paper, that's a much more like intentional focused activity. Like I still retain a lot of it, but it's like I'm working for it more, so I'm kind of absorbing it differently. Whereas like I love nonfiction, especially I love to do audiobooks because I just kind of want that stuff. It's like I'm just floating in it, right? It's just all around and I can kind of pluck things down as I need them.
Mhm. What do you do these days apart from coaching? Do you write? Do you write a lot still?
Yeah, so well, I still do copywriting, primarily email, and then I'm also working on a video game project, which I'm doing both the writing and the art direction for. And the art direction is really interesting because it's like that is truly a new skill set for me. Like aside, it's one thing to have like a good visual sense, which I have. I can't draw to save my life, so I'm hiring artists and trying to get what's in my head across to them is a whole process. And I'm loving it. It's really eye-opening. And I feel like I'm learning a ton just by doing that. And it gives me a new level of respect for like managing teams, right? Even just with this kind of work, like it's because I think when you're on the receiving end of management, it's very easy to get kind of annoyed and be like, oh, like that, they're not communicating clearly or whatever. But when you're in their seat, it is you start to see like even the things that are so simple and obvious to you are not at all obvious to the other person. And it is that's a huge part of like what management comes down to is like getting what's obvious, making what's obvious to you obvious to them, right? Um, which is yeah, I would say honestly, I think it's even a different type of communication than copywriting, right? Like because copywriting is much more provoking emotion and then backing it up with logic. But if you're trying to get someone to implement an idea for you, you really need both, right? Like you need them to, in fact, I would say if anything, you need much more of the logic. Like you need them to to understand what you're asking for and being able to implement it. Like that's a mostly logical process.
Mhm.
And so I think that's also why it can be a struggle to kind of bridge that gap from, hey, I'm really good at writing copy, creating offers, whatever, but I can't get people to implement for me effectively, right? It's like, well, it's a very different skill. Like it doesn't necessarily it's not it doesn't necessarily translate from one to the other.
Yes. So with what you do now, Sean, talk
Mhm.
about like the video game project. How does that tie into actually being a marketer? Are you involved in the whole thing, or the actual creation of the product itself?
We're in the creation of the product right now, and like kind of planting seeds for what the marketing is going to look like. And that's actually a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier. Like in terms of being able to create the thing I want to create. Um, Basically, like because with the video game industry, one way or another, like unless you're developing for a really well-known IP and you already have studio backing, like you need some kind of demo. You need something that people can actually put their hands on and play. Because like people will somewhat follow a game in development, but the thing that gets people actually excited and spreads the word is the product. And yes, there's marketing things you can do around that, but that's the thing we realize is like, in fact, even if we were to go and chase funding, we still like anyone can come up with an idea, but to actually have something built shows that like no, we're serious, right? Like we actually are making this thing. We can make it faster with your help, but this is what we've got. It's going to look something like this. You can here, touch it, play with it, right?
Is there still space for independent studios in mainstream gaming? I'm like quite shocked because I thought it had gotten so complicated and expensive to make things in recent years.
There is actually. I mean, if anything, there's indie games have been like just crushing it lately, like for a few years now, and I think mainly because like you can have a team of a handful of people that just really believe in the project. You come together and create something, and it's relatively easy. It's there are other problems with platforms like Steam, but it's not tough to get your thing onto the marketplace. And then as long as you're able to market it effectively, which again comes down to like getting people to play the demo and getting people to talk about it, there is a kind of like sink or swim aspect in the sense that the project tend to really take off get a it almost always comes down to a streamer talking about it and playing it on their stream, right? Um, because that's you're basically riding on the audience and credibility of that person, and then everyone sees it's like, oh wow, look at this amazing new game, right? Everyone go check it out. Um, and what's particularly interesting to me about that is like you'll see games that came out like 5 years ago all of a sudden blow up and get tons of sales. All of a sudden, like without any word in the meantime, they'll very quickly come out with a sequel because now there's interest and now there's buzz around it, and the sequel will do really well. But it's because at that 5 year point, that's when somebody like finally streamed it and talked about it, um, and showed people like, oh, look how cool this is. So like the discoverability piece is like I'd say the biggest like sink or swim thing for an independent studio. But again, like if you know that, you can strategize around that, right? Um, and two, it's like AAA games are getting so bloated that with a few exceptions, like you have things like Call of Duty that are just kind of perennial sellers, and those will basically always do okay. But then anything short of that, it is a really tough fight to get to get people actually like staying on and interested.
Mhm.
Um, And so, I do think there's a lot of white space in the industry, and also I'm just passionate about it, right? So like I at least have to try. Um, and yeah, I do think it's an interesting, going back to branding. Um, I think in a lot of ways the video game industry is like kind of the furthest opposite of VR because people are coming for enjoyment, right? They're not coming to like solve a bleeding neck problem. And also because of how the AAA space has been for the last few years, people are so skeptical and guarded and careful with their money that like a lot of the kind of traditional tricks of VR just really don't work. I mean, people will violently react to that kind of stuff in gaming because it's like they've seen it all. And they just want to play a good game and they don't want people screwing them out of their money.
It's so long since I played video games. Like I haven't played video games since my early 20s. Like other than,
Mhm.
my kids have a Nintendo, I'll play for 5 minutes with them now and then. But I used to be like really into it when I was a teenager. And I do remember, it's true, like pretty much the success of a game at that time was like print magazines.
Yeah.
If a game got some positive reviews in a few key print magazines, it would be a smash hit seller. And if it got like a really negative, bad reviews in like the tastemaker publications, that was it. It was
Yep.
dead in the water. Didn't matter how much marketing budget it had.
Yeah, and like I've even seen games that got a mixed review, right? Like very mixed reception. Some cases even really bad reception, but a few voices that like took the contrary, like genuinely, right? So like, hey, no, guys, give this another look. This is actually like people are not getting it. This is actually a great game. Even those games can still pull through. There's a game that came out years ago called Deadly Premonition. That's a perfect example of this. It's a sort of odd, frankly, kind of broken game in a lot of ways, but there was one reviewer in the particular back then who like really championed it, and like even as other places were kind of like giving it middling reviews, this guy gave it a 10 out of 10 and it's like, you have to play this game. And sure enough, it became a cult hit because there were just a handful of voices really championing it, and that one got a sequel too, right? Like that's what I find interesting about the industry too, is that um it isn't, and I think this is kind of true of entertainment in general. Um, it actually isn't winner takes all because people want novelty, they want new things. And even you look at how Marvel is facing Marvel fatigue, and they finally are like announced that they're actually pulling back on their production schedule. It's like even something like that was so dominant for so long, people still want something new, right? And they were running out of ways to find novelty within the Marvel universe, and so now they're just kind of pulling back, right? Um, so
There's
yeah, I think
bottomless
and I
demand
think
for
what's up?
entertainment. There's bottomless demand for entertainment.
Yeah, right,
And it serves no real useful purpose. It's a very strange thing.
right.
There's
Which
no
people do all kinds of things for no useful purpose, right? That's what I love about that book Wonderland is like Stephen Johnson, I think, is the author of the book. I actually have it around. But but yeah, because like again, I think if you only swim in DR circles, it's easy to think of everything in terms of like needs, right? Like, hard primal, like the big three, right? Sex, money, health, right? But which are true, those are always there. But there's like this whole layer of human behavior and the economy that isn't really directly connected to that. I mean, there are lines all the way through of our core needs, but there are all kinds of things we do where it's not immediately obvious that's why we're doing it, right? And there's all kinds of things we buy where it's not immediately obvious that's connected to one of those three needs.
Well, um, maybe not nihilistic, the more pessimistic your people would say that all of those things that don't fit neatly into the categories are about status signaling.
Which I actually I agree with.
Yeah.
A great book by Will Storr, The Status Game, right? Basically says that's basically the thesis of it. But I think what he does a really good job illustrating is, yes, it's all status at the end of the day, but we will create infinite different status games to try to find status, right? I think that's what's so fascinating about that book and just about people is like, everything from if everything from like who gets to be president to like your local bowling club is some form of status game, why don't we have enough, right? We're still creating new status games everywhere we go. Like there's infinite, and again, there's all those also translate into business opportunities as well. Like we can't not it's both. My take on it is we both have such a hunger for status, but because the bigger the status game, the harder it is to win. We want multiple sources of status, right? Like, and so that's why we find, that's why I create all these little subcultures and like, you know, fashion is just full of different little sub fashion groups. Cause it's like, if you can't be on the runways of Paris, like, well, you can be like the best dressed in this group of friends right here, right? Or in this little subculture right here. And so we will always be creating status games wherever we go, and we create new opportunities with those status games. So like, I don't think it's a particularly pessimistic take. I think the thing that makes it pessimistic is that if you remain incurious, right? Like I'm just fascinated by all the status games we create. That's why I think it's interesting and fun. Like,
You, from talking to you this evening, are somebody who sort of approaches life, it seems, from the perspective of both curiosity and then artistic interests. Like you, that's what you care about.
yeah,
Does that make it sometimes difficult to work on direct response projects where they can be, you know, very, what's the word, instrumentalist in their approach to things?
that's a good word for it. Yeah, I mean, definitely in the beginning, right? Like I think that was one of the most valuable things about working in-house. Because like for the first 4.5 years of copywriting, I was working in-house for a company, and that's where I really learned how to compartmentalize between my artistic sense and the things I want to create artistically versus what makes money, right? What gets the sale, both in terms of like, what keeps me on their payroll, but also like seriously, like how does copywriting work, right? Like how do you get people to buy things with your words? Which I took very seriously and still do. Like I think it's, you know, I think the bridge between the two for me is an appreciation of craft and understanding copywriting as a craft, right? Like there's no, frankly, there's no honor in using your creative abilities purely for your own interest, right? It's great to be interested. And I think definitely like your own interests are kind of a hint of which way to go. But what makes you a useful member of society is like creating things that can get things done. And that's where the more instrumental side comes in. I think also it helps that I'm a son of an engineer. So I do have a little bit of that strain too. Like I can kind of set aside the fluffy, magical side of things and be like, okay, this, these words form a machine. Is the machine getting the job done? Yes or no? If no, fix it, right? Um, so yeah, that's a good question. And it's something I deal with all the time, right? Like honestly, too, one last thing I'll say about that is this is exactly why I've always made sure to keep like even in my crunchiest times with my copywriting business, I still keep a finger on my other creative projects too, because I go crazy if I don't have those. Like it's actually working on those things too that allows me to do this side well. Like if I didn't have that, I'd start getting weird, right? Ask me how I know.
So you mean if you didn't have something that was just kind of a passion project to do, that you'd quickly lose interest or lose
I
find
get
you'd be going
cranky,
to
right? Like
crank.
I start trying to bend the copy stuff to try to fulfill this side, which is not the point, right? And I think that's the thing. I think honestly, that's like anyone who's gotten into this world for creative reasons, like regardless of where those creative pursuits end up, like whether you want to make that your main career or whatever, make sure you keep a hand on them because if you're anything like me, like you will it is so easy to make excuses in the moment of like, oh, I'm too busy, oh, whatever, right? I don't have the energy. Do it anyway, right? It actually gives you back more energy. At least for me, it's always giving back as much energy as it takes. And then that's the energy I can spend on the business, right? So yeah, like it's very important to keep the both going at the same time. It's not easy, but
No,
you know,
you've
worthwhile things rarely are.
you've lately become a dad as well.
That too, yeah.
What age are you, by the way, Sean? If it's okay to
What age am
ask.
I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm 32.
Okay, you're young. I thought
Yeah,
so. That beard,
yeah,
the beard kind of disguised a little bit, but you don't have many wrinkles
yeah.
yet. So, um, how'd you find it? How has that affected things?
I mean, it's the best thing that's ever happened to me, honestly. Like, I even it's those early days, like they're so exhausting, and it's so stressful just juggling everything. But I remember turning my wife so many times and sincerely saying, "This is the happiest I've ever been." Like, just getting to look him in the face every day, hearing his voice, like, it's amazing, and it does. Going back to the whole practical side of things, like, yeah, it has made it difficult to do everything else, right? Like, we actually had a great discussion about this the other night. I don't think I don't think the core of being a dad is actually that hard, for me at least. It's managing everything around it that becomes hard, right? Because it's like I want to just pour all my attention and energy here, and I love doing that. And even when it's challenging, it's still very rewarding. But then I also have to do all these other things too. Um, but by that same token, that is the thing that will allow me to model adulthood for him effectively, is showing that I can be a great dad, be loving, be connected, and then also do all these other things too. Like that's kind of I think that's the most important lesson you can pass down as a parent. And I certainly benefited from seeing my parents do that too. Like, yeah, it's I wouldn't say it's a balancing act, it's more of a juggling act, and there's chainsaws and flaming swords in the mix, but hey,
Yeah, no, it changes everything. It makes you care less about your own stuff in a good way. Like
yeah,
stuff that you thought mattered doesn't really actually matter all that much. You changes your priorities a lot.
yeah. And
And
it pushes your capabilities, right? Like there's there's so many little things like here's a really weird one. I never really messed with speech to text much in my writing until now because if I'm literally like sitting here like feeding the baby and I need to work on something, like I can't type, right? And so I was like, well, wait a second, like Google has this built in. So I just started like typing and like I mean, I know this has been around for a while, but for me it was mind blowing. It's like, holy crap, I can talk my copy and then just go clean it up later. Like amazing, right? But it's funny how like even the tools that were technically available to us the whole time, like it's that added pressure of being a dad that has forced me to actually use them now. And I think a lot of times like that is how like productivity hacks emerge is like when you really have no other choice, that's when you get resourceful.
yeah, although I actually never took to voice typing, but I've always thought it's probably a cool idea to try it once or twice. But I've tried it and it just doesn't do it for me. But I know there's something in it if you can speak out your copy that it's
Yeah.
good.
Even yeah, I mean, even while I was doing it, I was noticing like, man, there's something different about these emails that I'm speak typing that's like I probably couldn't explain to the AI what's different about it, but it's different. Um, and on top of that, like it's still not my first choice, right? Like if I can, I like to just type normally, but knowing that I have that in my back pocket, gives me the flexibility. I think that's the thing too, is like as far as like have the creative process, I'm obsessed with like both but the ideal, right? Like it's great to have those moments and know how to make the most of them. But I'm also obsessed with like basically learning in shit conditions. Like I always tell the story of like one of my first big weekends as a skier was I was 8 years old. We'd been out a few years before, and I'd gone a little bit down the bunny slopes, but I still didn't really know what I was doing. Um, but then it was that weekend I started learning, I started picking up the pace in my learning, and like one of the instructors took me all across the mountain, just me and him. And then finally I meet up with my dad and we're like, okay, like let's go. And this massive blizzard hits the mountain and it's like 6 foot visibility. And he even turns to me, my dad is, and he's like, do you want to just go back down? Like, and I'm like, no, I'm good. I'm feeling it. And sure enough, like, I think that was the capstone that like made me a skier that weekend was like, okay, no, you're not a pro skier yet, but now you have to figure out how to get down the mountain with 6 foot visibility. Right. And sure enough, like once I did that, like I remember that was such a turning point where I felt comfortable in basically any other conditions after that point. Because I was like, I've already done it in a blizzard. Like I can find it's great to have like the perfect powder and the blue sky and everything, but you don't get that every time. And I think same applies to any other creative process. Like there's going to be tight deadlines. There's going to be like you're going to be distracted by other things, but being able to operate anyway is such a huge skill. And I think it's one of those things that is not the sexiest thing, right? It's not the thing we want to talk about, but I think it's actually like one of those things that really gives you longevity.
Yes, being able to do good work with a gun to your head.
Yeah.
At this point in your career, Sean, where does business come from? Where does new work come from?
Mostly just through referrals, right? I think it's yeah, like like you talked about in your recent workshop, like those tend to be both the best and easiest gigs, right? Like the ones that just come through warm. And so yeah. And actually like that client I mentioned in the affiliate space, like we first met back when I was working in-house for the other company. And he had seen my work there, so it was just like, okay, well, now he's available for hire, let me get him.
Yeah, it's strange times, Let me see if camera fell.
But
My
no,
camera
no,
fell down. Just a
this has to
moment.
stay in the episode.
It will. I've been looking for a better quality camera, so I started to use a continuity camera on my iPhone.
Oh yeah.
And what's happened is the adhesive glue gets hot because the phone gets hot
Oh yeah.
during the interviews, and then it falls off its mounting position. So I have to figure out a workaround. I have to find a glue that's not heat sensitive for the mounting,
Yep.
which sounds ridiculous. But anyway, the last thing I wanted to talk about before we wrap up is just I saw, you've probably seen about Steph and Georgia talking about how copywriting is not a good thing to do now if you're just starting out. And for for a lot of people to say, people say something is dead all the time, biz op is dead or email is dead or blah blah blah, like. But for him, a guy who's like very well known primarily as a copywriter and somebody who's done a lot of copywriting training for many years now, to say that that's a big deal. For him to say like newcomers should not enter this industry. And I just kind of wanted your take because what you just said about referrals, what I said recently about like network is driving all my inbound. I mean, the thoughts of like applying cold to a gig where that like you're applicant number 237,
Right.
like that gives me the absolute horrors. Or the idea of like, doing some like kind of mass cold email strategy to try and get a I mean, it's one thing for B2B if you're trying to drive like a drive a new business for a company, but like as a solo like freelancer or whatever, solopreneur, whatever, the idea of doing like a mass cold email strategy again just gives me the horrors. So like, yeah, I just wanted your sort of take on this.
I think it's a really good question. There's a lot of different pieces to that. So I think let's zoom out a bit and just look at, is this an industry you want to be in? Is this the kind of work you want to be in? Because if the answer is yes, then ultimately, like, the kind of twin peaks, and they're not mutually exclusive, are like marketing consultant or offer owner, right? And so with those being the peaks, like there are many little trails you can take up from the bottom, right? Copywriting has been one of them historically. And I think will continue to be one for people that are built for it, right? And I think that's the thing that is changing, is that and I'm honestly like, it's interesting with Stefan, like I I see where he's coming from, and I also I wonder how much the the biz opification of copywriting was even a thing, in the sense that, like, was was the barrier to entry there really lowered? Kind of, I think definitely, like, with the training and resources out there, like maybe a few people that would not have made it in that way did. Um, but
There was an
ultimately, like,
explosion of demand. There was an explosion of demand.
right, right, exactly. Yeah, there's an explosion of demand, and so, which in a sense, right, like does lower the barrier, right? Because, like, well, there's, it's easier to get your first gig. Um, but then But then it's like, well, what about the next, like literally the next step, right? Like, what happens there? Well, then it goes back to all the stuff we've been talking about here, um, which is still just as important as it's ever been and will continue to be, right? It's like it's your ability to develop those skills, that are going to make your career. And I think there's, and I think this is true of a lot of career paths. There are a million starting points, but they filter out very quickly. And so so the important thing is to kind of begin with the end in mind, and figure out, like, okay, is that the place you want to be? Then go look at, like, just take whatever starting point you can get. Like, I know Stefan was talking about the uh that, like, TikTok thing. Which, like, cool, if you want to start with that, great. It's probably not for everybody, right? I'm probably not a good fit for that. Like, I'm not, I don't think I'm really built for TikTok. But that's fine. I already have copywriting. And so I think, as far as, like, yes, I agree in the sense that copywriting is probably not the right choice for most people. Um, and I also think that once you develop the mindset, and it's not a either or thing, it's an ongoing thing. Like, you can take any one of those starting points and use it to take the next step towards the thing you ultimately want, or to discover the thing you ultimately want. It's part of why, like, I still talk to people who got started on, like, Upwork or Fiverr, which in some case, in some sense, are like the worst place to start your career, because, like, they're inherent, you're inherently going to be underpriced, but it's a great place to get discovered and get your first gig. And then if you learn how to leverage that, you can turn it into, like, a proper freelancing career. And hell, there's some people who just, like, I mean, they tend to be just workhorses, right? But there are people who, like, stay on there for years, sustainably, right? Like, and I think that's, if anything, copywriting is just going to kind of go back to that sort of position where the door is still open, it's just not as open, right? It's a little bit, it's more of a narrow crack. But if you really want it, it's still there. Um, and I also think, like, personally, I have always taken kind of the opposite view of, to like how BizOp is structured. And I understand why it's structured this way, but it's like, the minute something is pitched to me as anyone can do it, I don't want to do it. I don't. Because it's like, well, okay, that means it's only a matter of time until everyone's trying to do it. And also, like, if it's built for everyone, like, what about my unique talents and skills, right? Like, I've invested a lot in sharpening those. I'm very proud of them. I enjoy using them. So I'd rather find the path that lets me use those. And I think, honestly, that's, if you're early in your career, that's a much better frame of mind, which I know I understand can be tough when you're trying to get out of a tight financial spot, right?
Yeah.
But as soon as you get some breathing room, those are the questions to ask yourself. Like, what are your unique talents? What do you actually enjoy doing? And let that guide your next step.
Yeah. So it's kind of the thing. If you're in it for the money, you're probably not going to stay the distance. If you
Yeah,
just come in to make a buck, you're not going to stick
yeah.
around too long. You'll wash out when it gets hard.
Ironically, right? Because like that's how most people. I mean, so I'm one of the few exceptions, but it's like you always ask, like, when did you first type how to make money online into Google? Like that's how this industry recruits, by and large, right? Like, come for
It's
the
a very
money, right?
inefficient process, but somehow, enough people survive.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, again, wide pyramid, right? Like if you start with a large enough base, some of them will survive. Um, but yeah, it's like, frankly, don't if you're early on, like don't let yourself be a statistic, right? Like figure out and I think too, like when people hear because I used to have the same problem all the time. It's like when you hear like what makes you unique, it's really easy to overthink that and think like, oh, I have to be like the only person in the world that can do this thing. It's like, no, it's everything, you and I were talking about earlier. Like having your own spin on things, right? Which it doesn't take a lot of experience to do. And frankly, like that helps you stand out. And anything to separate you from the rest of that wide base helps. And you're not trying to, become the next guru overnight. You're just trying to get that next gig and that next gig, raise your prices a little more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Like it reminds me, it's fine just because it came up today. Um, like one of my favorite things that Gary Vee ever said was the whole idea of the clouds and the dirt. Like, I think that's a great analogy. Like the clouds is what you ultimately dream of doing, and whether that's like the kind of work, the income, the lifestyle, whatever. And then the dirt is like literally what are you doing in the next 24 hours, right? And just taking both those things seriously and then kind of ignoring everything in the middle, like that's it, right? That's all most of us have been doing anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. Sean, thank you for being here tonight.
Yeah, man. It was a
Where can
pleasure.
people find you?
Easiest way is just connect with me on Facebook. It's I can give you a link later, but it's
Oh,
just
don't
S
worry.
Mabry.
I'll
Yeah,
put the details in the video description.
cool.
But if people
Um,
want to find you, they find you on Facebook.
yeah, you can check out my website too. It's just seanmabry.com. Potentially it'll be something different by the time this goes out because I've
You
been
got
kind of
12
wanting to
weeks.
do work. Okay, yeah, we'll see, we'll see.
The
But yeah, in the
publishing schedule is
meantime,
backed up a long way at this point.
right. Yeah, seanmabry.com and Facebook.
Awesome. Thank you once more. Gonna stop the
Awesome.
recording now.